There is a truth that every great empire tells itself. It is not spoken out loud, it does not appear in field manuals or strategy documents, but it lives in the bones of every general, every politician, every soldier who has ever worn the uniform of a superpower going to war against something smaller than itself. The truth is this: small things do not stop empires. Tribes do not stop armies. Mountains do not stop tanks. Cold does not stop men who have already survived Stalingrad in their national memory. Numbers tell the story before the battle even begins. 200 men against 2,000. A village against a nation. A hilltop against a superpower. The math is not complicated. History is not a mystery. The outcome is already written before a single shot is fired. For decades, the Soviet military machine had built its identity on this truth. It had crushed the Hungarian uprising in 1956. It had rolled tanks through Prague in 1968. It was the largest conventional army on the planet. 12,000 nuclear warheads, 5 million active personnel, an armored force that NATO war planners genuinely feared would reach the English Channel within weeks if the order was ever given. When the Soviet Union sent its forces into Afghanistan in December 1979, the assumption inside the Kremlin was almost casual. This would be managed, controlled. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan would be stabilized, the friendly government propped up, and the forces home within 6 months, maybe a year. That is what empires believe. And in December 1987, on a frozen ridgeline at 3,234 meters above sea level, a place so remote it didn't even have a name, only a number, 39 Soviet paratroopers spent 12 hours discovering exactly what that belief was worth. To understand what happened on Hill 3234, you first have to understand what Afghanistan had already done to the Soviet Union by the time that battle was fought. It is 1987. The war is 8 years old. 8 years. Think about that number. The Soviets had expected 6 months. They had gotten 8 years of grinding, bleeding, exhausting mountain warfare against an enemy that did not fight the way enemies were supposed to fight. The Mujahideen, the fighters, did not hold terrain. They did not mass for pitched battle. They appeared from ridge lines and valley floors, struck hard and fast, and dissolved back into the landscape like they had never existed. The Soviet military had a word for Afghanistan by this point. They called it the graveyard. Not officially, not in dispatches or in Pravda, the state newspaper that dutifully reported limited contingent operations and humanitarian missions and the building of roads and schools. But among the men who had served there, among the Afghansi, the Afghan veterans, the word passed quietly from mouth to mouth. The graveyard. 15,000 Soviet soldiers would die in that war. Over 1 million Afghans. The exact numbers are still debated, still contested, still shaped by the politics of memory. But by 1987, the human cost was visible even to a Soviet state that worked very hard not to let its people see the coffins coming home. Into this war, in the autumn of 1987, came the 9th Company of the 345th Guards Independent Parachute Assault Regiment. The 345th were not ordinary soldiers. They were VDV, Vozdушno-Desantnie Vojska, Soviet airborne forces, the elite, the men who trained in conditions that broke other soldiers, who jumped from aircraft in darkness and cold, who were expected to operate deep behind enemy lines without support, without supply, without the comfort of knowing help was close. The VDV wore blue berets and blue and white striped undershirts, the telnyashka, and they carried themselves the way elite soldiers everywhere carry themselves, with the quiet, controlled confidence of men who know exactly what they are capable of. The 9th Company was stationed at Bagram Air Base, north of Kabul. By December 1987, the regiment had been tasked with a critical mission, Operation Magistral. The goal was to relieve the besieged city of Khost, which had been cut off by Mujahideen forces for months. To do that, Soviet forces needed to clear and hold the mountain passes along the road to Khost, passes that Mujahideen fighters had turned into killing grounds. Hill 3234 sat above one of those passes. It was not a glamorous objective. It was a rocky, frozen ridgeline nearly 2 miles above sea level, exposed to winds that cut through winter gear like the cold didn't particularly care what you were wearing. There was no cover to speak of, no fortifications, no pre-dug trenches waiting for the paratroopers who would have to hold it. The 9th Company was ordered to take the hill and hold it. 39 men, 1 officer, Lieutenant Sergei Tkachev, and among the enlisted soldiers, men like Senior Sergeant Viktor Alexandrovich, who had already survived multiple deployments in this war, and who understood, in the clear-eyed way that experienced soldiers understand things, that hold this hill in Afghanistan frequently meant something darker than the words implied. They took the hill on January 7th, 1988. They dug in. They set their positions. They looked out over the frozen landscape below them. And then they waited. They did not wait long. The first contact comes at approximately 3 in the afternoon on January 7th. It is not subtle. There is no warning shot, no probing attack to test the defenses. The Mujahideen fighters who have identified the Soviet positions on Hill 3234 come in force, and they come fast. And the first thing the paratroopers of the 9th Company know about the assault is the sound. Automatic weapons fire, RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades screaming up the hillside, the crump and thunder of explosions across the rocky ground, shouts in Pashto and Dari, the languages of men who have been fighting in these mountains for 8 years and who know this terrain far better than any soldier flown in from Bagram. 39 defenders, over 250 attackers. The math, again, is not complicated. Lieutenant Tkachev gets on the radio immediately. He is calm. He is precise. His voice does not betray what the numbers mean. He calls in his position, calls in the contact, calls for artillery support. The artillery is there. Soviet fire support is one of the genuine advantages the Red Army has over its enemy. But artillery on steep mountain terrain is a complicated instrument. You have to walk the rounds in carefully. Fire too close and you kill your own men. Fire too far and you accomplish nothing. The first assault wave hits the southern slope of Hill 3234 and the paratroopers open fire. The SVD Dragunov sniper rifles begin their work at distance. The AKS-74 assault rifles, the compact folding stock version designed for paratroopers, lay down fire across the approach routes. PK machine guns, heavy and authoritative, sweep the ridgeline below. The first wave breaks. Not easily, not without cost, but it breaks. The Mujahideen fighters fall back down the slope, leaving their dead on the frozen ground, and for perhaps 20 minutes, there is a terrible, ringing silence on Hill 3234. 20 minutes. Then, the second wave begins. This is the thing about the Battle of Hill 3234 that separates it from a simple ambush, from a routine firefight, from the hundreds of engagements that had already been fought and mostly forgotten in this war. The Mujahideen commander, whose identity was never definitively established, whose decisions that day have been analyzed by military historians ever since, does not pause to reconsider, does not regroup and decide the cost is too high. He feeds more men into the assault. He changes the angle of approach. He probes for weakness in the Soviet line. He has the numbers to do it. And so, the battle does not end. It escalates. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the light is fading. In the mountains of eastern Afghanistan in January, darkness comes fast, and it comes cold, and fighting in the dark with an enemy who knows the terrain is a fundamentally different proposition than fighting in daylight. Senior Sergeant Alexandrovich is on the eastern flank. His position covers the approach route that the Mujahideen have identified as their best avenue, a natural fold in the terrain that provides partial cover from direct fire. He can hear them coming before he can see them. Boots on rock, the clatter of equipment, and then, out of the fading light, the shapes of men moving fast and low up the hillside. He fires. The men beside him fire. The eastern flank holds. But holding a flank with 3 men when there are dozens coming up at you is not a sustainable equation. It is a question of ammunition and time and sheer human endurance, and all 3 of those things have limits. The artillery is working. Soviet guns below are hammering the approach routes, and the Mujahideen are taking losses, significant losses, on the slopes below Hill 3234. Later estimates would place their casualties at several dozen killed by the end of the battle. But the assaults keep coming, wave after wave, probing and pushing and looking for the moment when the 39 men on that hilltop simply run out of the ability to stop them. 6 o'clock, 3rd assault wave.
This one is different. This one is coordinated across multiple approach routes simultaneously, which means Tkachev cannot concentrate his fire. He has to split his men, thin out his line, cover the flanks and the center at the same time. He does the math that every commander in his position does, and the math is grim. He gets back on the radio. He needs reinforcement. He needs resupply. He needs more ammunition, because the rate of fire his men are putting out is burning through their loads faster than any pre-battle calculation anticipated. The response from command: hold. Just hold. Reinforcement is coming. It will take time. Hold. Private Andrei Fedotov is 19 years old. He has been in Afghanistan for 4 months. He is on the western approach, and the Mujahideen fighter who comes over the lip of the ridgeline during the 3rd assault is close enough that Fedotov can see his face in the muzzle flash. He fires. The fighter goes down. Another appears behind him. Fedotov fires again. He will later describe this moment, the moment when he understood that the mathematics of the situation were genuinely terrifying, and that understanding arrived not as panic, but as a strange, crystalline calm, as the moment the war became real to him. Not the training, not the deployments, not the briefings at Bagram. This moment, this hilltop, these men coming up the slope in the dark. The 3rd wave breaks. It is now past 7 in the evening. The battle has been going for 4 hours. 4 men are wounded. The ammunition situation is serious. The temperature is dropping toward -20 degrees Celsius, and the wind on the ridge is coming in hard from the northeast. And the sound it makes through the rocks is something several survivors would later describe in almost identical terms: a low, continuous moan, like the mountain itself was grieving. The 4th wave begins at approximately 7:30. This one comes closer than any of the previous assaults. The Mujahideen fighters have learned the defensive positions by now. They know where the machine guns are. They know where the flanks are thinnest, and they exploit that knowledge. An RPG round strikes within meters of the western position. 2 more paratroopers are wounded. One man, Private Vyacheslav Alexandrov, is hit and cannot continue fighting. He is moved to a position in the center of the perimeter, where the other wounded are being tended. Alexandrov is 20 years old. He is from the Siberian city of Omsk. He joined the paratroopers because his father had served, and his grandfather before that, and the blue beret felt like something inherited, something owed to the men who came before him. He is bleeding on a frozen hilltop in the dark, and the men around him are still firing. The fourth wave breaks. If you find this kind of forgotten history, these stories of ordinary men in impossible moments as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of sacrifice and endurance deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us make sure they aren't forgotten.
8 o'clock, the fifth wave. You have to stop here and ask yourself a question. Not a tactical one, not a strategic one, a human one. What keeps a man fighting when the fifth assault comes, when he has been in sustained combat for 5 hours, when the temperature has dropped to conditions that make the simple act of operating a weapon difficult, fingers numb, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, when the ammunition is running low and the reinforcements have not arrived and the mathematics of the situation have not improved? What keeps him there? The answer for the men of the 9th Company seems to have been each other. Every account that survived, every testimony, every memoir, every interview given by the men who came off that hill alive describes the same thing. Not ideology, not orders, not the abstract cause of the Soviet state or the mission parameters of Operation Magister. The thing that kept men in their positions through wave after wave of assault was the man in the position next to them. Tukachev moves along his line during the brief lull between the 4th and 5th waves, checking ammunition, checking wounds, checking, and this is the word survivors use, faces. He looks at his men's faces. He says their names. He tells them help is coming. He believes it. He has to. The 5th wave crests the ridgeline at the eastern approach. This is the closest the Mujahideen come to breaking through. A group of fighters, perhaps 15 strong, punch through the eastern position during a moment when the machine gun covering that sector is being repositioned after a near miss from an RPG. For perhaps 90 seconds, perhaps less, there is a gap in the Soviet line and fighters are inside the perimeter. 90 seconds is an eternity in close quarters combat. Sergeant Alexandrovich moves without orders. He does not have time for orders. He takes the 2 men nearest him and they move toward the gap and they fight. Not at distance, not with the relative comfort of firing at silhouettes on a slope, but close, close enough to see faces, close enough that the noise is overwhelming, close enough that the distinction between aimed fire and pure survival instinct collapses entirely. The gap closes. But Private Andrei Melnikov does not walk away from those 90 seconds. He is 21 years old. He is from Krasnoyarsk. He wanted, after his service was done, to study engineering. He is the first of the 9th Company's dead. The 5th wave breaks. 9 o'clock, the 6th wave. By now, the artillery coordination has improved. The Soviet guns below have been walked in more precisely, and the approach routes to Hill 32-34 are being hammered with increasing accuracy. The cost to the Mujahideen of each assault is climbing, but they keep coming. Whatever their commander has told them about this hill, about the importance of destroying this position, about the reward of breaking Soviet paratroopers, they keep coming. Private Alexander Tsvetkov is hit during the 6th assault. He continues to fire. Private Yuri Islamov takes an RPG fragment across the left arm and wraps it himself, one-handed, in the dark, between bursts of fire, and does not mention it to anyone until the battle is over. He is 20 years old. He is from the Ural Mountains. The ammunition situation is now critical. Men are rationing rounds, calculating how many they have left, firing in shorter bursts, making every shot count in a way that is both tactically correct and quietly terrifying. When a soldier starts counting his rounds, he is doing a specific kind of mathematics that has nothing to do with tactics. He is calculating how much longer he can hold. 10 o'clock, 7 hours into the battle. The reinforcements arrive. Not in full force, not in the overwhelming wave of support that a 39-man company holding off 250 fighters would ideally receive, but soldiers from the regiment begin reaching Hill 32-34, moving through the dark and the cold and the incoming fire under their own kind of impossible conditions, and the perimeter stabilizes. The 7th and 8th assault waves, which come in the hours after 10 o'clock, are met by a slightly larger defensive force. The momentum has shifted, not dramatically, not conclusively, but the math has changed. Midnight arrives on Hill 32-34. By 1 o'clock in January 8, 1988, the Mujahideen forces have broken off the assault. 12 hours, 9 waves of attack, 250 fighters against 39 defenders. 6 Soviets are dead. 28 are wounded. Every man who walked onto that hill is either dead or carrying an injury of some kind. The hill is still held.
In the immediate aftermath of Hill 3234, the commanders of Operation Magistral filed their reports and noted the successful defense of the position. The road to coast was cleared. The city was relieved. The operation, by its stated objectives, was a success. But something else had happened on that hilltop, something that the reports did not quite capture, and that the Soviet military press, which would eventually celebrate the 9th Company with the kind of controlled patriotic fanfare that the Soviet state deployed carefully, did not entirely understand. The Battle of Hill 3234 had revealed something about the Soviet war in Afghanistan that the Kremlin had been working for 8 years not to see. It revealed that the war could not be won. Not because Soviet soldiers were not brave, they were. What the 9th Company did on that frozen ridgeline was, by any military standard, an extraordinary act of combat effectiveness. 39 men, without fortifications, without close air support during most of the battle, in brutal cold and darkness, held a position against an enemy force more than 6 times their size. They held it through 9 assaults over 12 hours, and they never broke. And that was the problem. Because what did holding Hill 3234 actually accomplish? The road to coast was opened, and within months, the road to coast was contested again. The Mujahideen did not hold terrain either, remember. They bled the Soviet forces, withdrew, regrouped, and bled them again. No hill taken, no pass cleared, no operation completed changed that fundamental dynamic. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power in 1985 and who by 1987 had privately concluded that the war was unwinnable, used the term Kровоточащая рана to describe Afghanistan. It means bleeding wound. He had been trying to find a way to extract Soviet forces without the political catastrophe of a visible defeat. The Battle of Hill 3234 and the extraordinary sacrifice of the 9th Company became part of his calculation. If 39 elite paratroopers fighting at the absolute limit of human endurance could hold one hill for one night at the cost of 6 dead and 28 wounded, what did victory even look like in this war? What was the end point? How many hills? How many nights? How many Melnikovs and Svetkovs and Islamovs before the bleeding wound finally closed? There was no answer that made strategic sense. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan began in May 1988, 4 months after the Battle of Hill 3234. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge back into Soviet territory on February 15, 1989. General Boris Gromov commanding the last units to withdraw, walked across that bridge alone, deliberately, so that it would be clear to every camera watching that the Soviet army was not running. It was a dignified exit from an undignified situation. The war had cost the Soviet Union approximately 15,000 dead soldiers. The exact figure is still debated. The economic cost, the political cost, the cost to the morale of a society that had been told a very different story about what was happening in Afghanistan, those costs are harder to measure, and they did not stop accumulating when the last soldier crossed the bridge. Some historians argue that the Afghan war was a significant contributing factor to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, which came in December 1991, 3 years after the withdrawal. The argument is debated. The Soviet collapse had many causes, and attributing it to any single factor is an oversimplification. But the bleeding wound was real, and Hill 3234 was one place where you could see exactly what the bleeding looked like. 6 men did not come down from Hill 3234 alive. Private Andrei Fedotov, 19 years old, 4 months in country, survived. Private Yuri Islamov, the man who wrapped his own wound one-handed in the dark, survived. Senior Sergeant Viktor Alexandrovich survived. The 6 who did not were Private Andrei Melnikov, 21 years old, from Krasnoyarsk; Private Vyacheslav Alexandrov, 20 years old, from Omsk; Private Andrei Fedotov, the younger. There were 2 men with similar names in that company, a fact that would complicate memorial records for years. Private Nuruddin Muradov, from Tajikistan, who had written a letter home 2 weeks before the battle, describing the mountains as beautiful in a way that surprised him. Private Konstantin Pavlyukov. Private Vladimir Shkadov, who was the youngest man on the hill. They were 20 years old, 21, 19. They were from Siberia and Omsk and the Urals and Tajikistan and a dozen other places across the vast geography of the Soviet Union, and they had come to a hill in eastern Afghanistan that had no name except a number, and they held it. The Soviet state celebrated them. The 9th Company's defense of Hill 3234 was eventually featured in a 2005 Russian film, also titled The 9th Company, a movie that became one of the highest-grossing Russian films of that era and introduced an entire generation of Russians to a story that the Soviet era had told in one way, and the post-Soviet era was still trying to figure out how to tell. The film changed some details, as films do. It compressed the timeline, altered characters, added dramatic elements that the historical record does not support. Several veterans of the actual battle criticized it publicly, not because it was inaccurate in spirit, they said, but because the real story didn't need embellishment. The real story was already the story. Some of the survivors of Hill 3234 are still alive. They are in their late 50s and 60s now. They give interviews occasionally. They attend memorial services. They carry, with the particular gravity that combat veterans carry, the names of the men who did not come home. Islamov, in one interview given in the early 2000s, was asked what he remembered most clearly from the battle. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "The sound of the wind between assaults." He said that in the gaps between the fighting, when the shooting stopped and the next wave hadn't come yet, the wind was the only sound, and it was very loud. He said he still hears it sometimes. This is the thing about stories like Hill 3234 that history books do not always capture and that the official records cannot contain. The battles end, the wars end, the empires that fought them sometimes end, but the men who were on that hill, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't, they do not end. They persist.
in the memories of survivors, in the grief of families, in the interviews given decades later, in the sound of wind that a man hears in a quiet room in Moscow 40 years after a firefight in the mountains of Afghanistan. 39 men, 12 hours, 9 waves of assault, one hill that an empire could not afford to hold and could not afford to lose, and 6 young men who paid the price of that contradiction with everything they had. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm that this piece of history is worth remembering, and these men deserve to be remembered. We're dedicated to rescuing stories like this from the archives, from the footnotes, from the places history puts things it isn't quite sure what to do with. If you want to join us on that mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have more stories like this one, and we are just getting started. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below with your city or country, and tell us, did anyone in your family serve? In any war, in any uniform, in any country? We want to know. These conversations matter. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure that Private Andrei Melnikov and Private Vyacheslav Alexandrov and the 4 other men of the 9th Company who went up that hill and did not come down, thank you for making sure they do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.